Welcome to Navigating Consumer and Family Law Challenges. Insights from SoCal's trusted attorneys.
Hello and welcome to Navigating Consumer and Family Law Challenges. Insights from SoCal's trusted attorneys with Amanda Hill and Sara Khosroabadi. With a focus on family law, consumer protection, and employment law, Amanda and Sara offer helpful, caring, and professional legal services and advice. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and in today's episode, we're doing the divorce financial checklist. Are you ready? Sara, Amanda, great to see you guys.
Good to see you too, Kevin.
So Amanda, how common is it for people to delay filing for divorce while they wait to be, quote unquote, financially ready? Is that really something you can ever fully prepare for?
I mean, I do see it a lot. In fact, we'll talk to clients sometimes and then they'll reach back out to us in a couple of months, even sometimes in a year, 2 years, because they're so overwhelmed by, especially people who have been married for a really long time and they have no idea what their finances are or what even, how to pay certain bills. I mean, we've had clients come to us and we ask them, when's the last time you paid your taxes? Or do you have a copy of your last tax return? And they will say, I don't know. He just signs for me, or she just signs for me. I have no idea. And that happens. And then we have to give them a list and kind of guide them step by step of, okay, well, here's where we're going to start. And you need to start pulling this information. And if you don't have access to it, then we're going to have to do it in a legal way and get those documents. So yeah, it actually does happen a lot. And sometimes when we tell them what that looks like, they shut down and they're like, okay, maybe it's not so bad. And maybe I'll just delay this again until I can figure that out. Or they start figuring out what their finances are going to look like under two different households. And especially with the economy right now, people just get overwhelmed by that thought. And so, yeah, I definitely see that.
Boy, so it's like, instead of stay together for the kids, it's stay together for the finances.
Yes. And, it really depends on a case-by-case basis what happens. But sometimes the nice part is if they own their home, on the flip side, they might have to sell it. A lot of people are having to sell their homes right now because they can't buy the other spouse out.
Right.
But at least they have some sort of cash flow that they'll be coming in to kind of start anew thereafter. But with interest rates the way they are right now, some people can't even afford to go buy something else because they won't be able to afford that monthly payment. So, it overwhelms people, and they'll continue to nest together for an extended period of time, especially if there are children involved. So, we're seeing a shift right now based on the economy and how people are approaching their divorce cases.
In your experience as a family law attorney, how would you define what it means to be financially ready to file for divorce?
I mean, the first thing I always tell my clients is, gather the documentation, figure out what even exists, what your household expenses are. And then from there, what are your assets? What are your debts? What are your, required overhead costs each month? And then because again, sometimes they don't even know that. So that's the first step. And then after that, it's kind of figuring out, what is your goal at the end of all of this? Are you okay with downsizing? Are there certain things that are an absolute for you? For example, sometimes I have clients say, I have to live close to where my kids' schools are. I don't want this to be too much change for them. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that we know that that's one of their goals that we have to focus on. So it really just depends.
Are there mistakes that you see people make when it comes to financials that could be avoided with better preparation?
Yes. And I really think that comes down to having, I hate to say this, and I don't want people to not trust their spouses, but sometimes people just have blind trust and they don't know what they should know, even just basics. Like, it's one thing to have one spouse handle all the bills and paying them, but you should know what they are. Yeah. And if you don't, then you should find out, because usually one spouse just innately is better at handling those things. And that's fine. However you want to work that, especially though, if you're going through a hard time and you're thinking, ooh, we might end up getting separated. You tried marital counseling. It's not working out. It's time to start gathering your information and figuring out what your finances look like and where you kind of are frozen in time with what is going on, what your expenses are, and what your debts are, and what everybody's going to be responsible for. The other thing I see is that people think that if, for example, a credit card is only in their name, oh, I'm not going to be responsible for that. It's only my spouse's name. Or we never commingled money. We always had our own checking and savings accounts, and our income has always been deposited into those. So I'm not worried about it. But in the state of California, unless you have a prenup, everything is community property. So it doesn't matter how title is held. And a lot of people don't understand that. And of course, they think it's unfair. And so they oversimplify. That's one of the biggest mistakes I think people make, is they think it's going to be a simple process because maybe they did handle their own separate finances. But sometimes that's almost worse, because then you don't know what exists on the other side. And
Right.
I've had circumstances where their other spouse is more of a spender, and they find out he's got 30 grand in credit card debt. And then I'll go, well, did he buy any recent big purchases? Well, yeah, he did buy a new car, and he does like to gamble a lot. And then all of a sudden they start putting the pieces together. Oh, okay, I can see where this is coming from now.
Yeah, no, another thing I'd like to add is oftentimes we get clients who call in and they say, we've already agreed on a lot of the stuff, and they don't necessarily know what they're even agreeing to. And we like to say, it's very important that you know what's on the table before you agree to anything, because how do you make that decision? How do you decide what you're going to take or what you're going to give up if you don't even know what assets and debts are there? So it's really important to kind of have the full picture before you make any, verbal agreements. They're not necessarily going to hold up in court all the time, but you've now set a precedent with your ex, or, the person that you're getting divorced with, that's going to be kind of the idea of what's going to happen. So that's another thing that I think is pretty important too.
And let me piggyback off that. It's interesting that you bring that up, Sarah, because I do often get that. And they say, I just want to do this the most efficient way as possible. I can't spend a bunch of money on this. We've already kind of reached an agreement. And then I'll start asking some follow-up questions like, okay, well, do you know your spouse? Do they have retirement through their employer? Yeah, I believe he has something. I'm not sure, but I don't want to touch that. I don't want to touch that. Do you know what you're entitled to? Do you know what it even exists? Is it a pension? Is it a 401k? Is it a 403b? Like, what are we talking about? And then sometimes they'll find out through the disclosure process in the divorce, things were oversimplified by their spouse because their other spouse didn't want them to know that they had certain assets, and they just wanted to kind of brush it over like, oh, you don't touch mine, I won't touch yours. But then one spouse has 250 in a 401k and the other one has 10. And so clearly that's not equitable, especially if one spouse, for example, took time off of work or doesn't do as many hours because they're at home taking care of the kids. Making sure you have an attorney look at what is allegedly agreed to is always important too.
Sarah, is there anything else that you would point to for like a so-called maybe financial readiness plan that someone might want to put together, or like at least mentally put together before they go down this road?
Yeah, I think it's important for everyone to know, like, even if you haven't been paying for all the bills, or you don't really know what the circumstances are of how everything has been paid, it's important to gather that information. So looking at, what are the actual bills that are coming into the house, like maybe kind of keeping track of what those are, writing it down, taking pictures, making copies, things like that are really important. And then also, as far as the debts are concerned, I mean, you definitely want to know, especially if your name is on a credit card, what that looks like. So pulling your credit report is really important, knowing what is on your credit. And I hate to say it, but oftentimes there's, financial abuse that goes on, and you didn't even realize that somebody took out a credit card in your name. And then that leads to identity theft. And it's, a lot of people think it's harder to claim it's identity theft because it's my husband or it's my wife or it's my spouse. So how is anybody going to believe that this was identity theft issue? So I think that that's important to kind of get an idea of, like Amanda said, kind of like the snapshot of what's happening today as you're getting ready for that divorce, so that you can be prepared for that. And you can ask those questions as you're going through the process and say, I never took out this credit card, or I didn't charge this money to the credit card. So as my attorney, can you look into that, or, get me more information as to whether or not I owe that? I think that's important too. And then also, it's very, it's a difficult time in somebody's life. Nobody's excited to go through a divorce. And I think that oftentimes, as a defense mechanism, some people just decide that they kind of don't want to maybe pay attention to those things. If you're going to go through a divorce, I think it's really important that, defense mechanism wise, maybe putting aside the idea of, I'm just going to let somebody else kind of handle it, I'm just going to do whatever that other person, my spouse says mentality, because that's not going to do you really well in making sure that you're setting yourself up financially for a successful, fresh start after the divorce. So those are a couple things that I would suggest.
Amanda, how do you advise clients to deal with shared debts, mortgages, or loans during a divorce, especially if you're trying to ensure a fair and equitable resolution?
Yeah, I mean, the second step of every divorce case is what's called the financial disclosure phase of the case. So there's two times that you do that. The first time is preliminarily before you can sign any agreements. You have to disclose all of your income, all of your assets, and all your debts on 3 required forms, and as well as gathering the backup documentation that shows what you're putting on those forms. And then they're served on the other side. After that, then you kind of look at the big picture of, okay, my spouse is saying that this is what exists. This is what I'm saying exists. Do they align? Is there stuff that I didn't know about? Is there something on here that he didn't claim? And then going through and making sure that the characterization of what's being listed is everybody's on the same page, because sometimes people think, oh, that's my separate property. But technically, well, if it was purchased during the marriage and it wasn't used with inheritance or other separate funds that could be easily traced, then it's community property. But again, sometimes it comes down to people assuming based on how it's held or title. For example, like a car. Well, I purchased that car and it's only in my name, and the car note is only in my name, so it's my car. Well, no, not under California law, right? So kind of figuring out and getting together of like, what are things that we can easily agree to that there's no dispute on, and then are there things that we're disputing over, and then kind of looking into those issues deeper.
That's interesting, because I honestly, I mean, I'm not in California and I'm sure it varies by state, but I didn't realize that about something like a car. I would have thought that both names would have to be on it. Like my wife and I, both our names are on both of our cars, even though one's technically mine, or one's kind of mine and one's kind of hers, right? So like, I didn't know that was just something that was automatically assumed under the law.
Yeah, California is a community property state, so doesn't matter how title is held necessarily. It matters how was it the asset purchased, or how was it obtained, when it was obtained, and with what funds. And that's really what the court comes down to. It doesn't matter necessarily about title. Now, when we come into real estate or real property, it's a lot more detailed. There's a lot more exceptions to that, but that can be a whole other episode.
What about just stuff? Like, you spend $1,000 on a snowblower. Like what is that? Like, who gets the snowblower? Is that, is that something that you have to like, is it technically both people's, even if one person was the one who kind of bought it with like an account that they have on their own?
So that's a very layered question. So I'll break it down a little bit. It doesn't matter, again, unless that money existed before marriage, it's still community property.
Okay.
But the hope is that the spouses don't hate each other so much that they can figure out those small personal property issues amongst themselves. But I will say, I have had clients, and I always use this example because it's the most crazy one in my mind that I'll never forget, is I was at a deposition once, and this young couple was arguing over who was going to get which vacuum. And we're not talking about a very expensive vacuum. We're talking about, I want this vacuum and I want this vacuum, and nickel and diming over how much they paid at Home Depot for those items.
Wow.
So the hope is that if you're listening to this, you're not in that type of a situation where you can use common sense and logic to figure out hiring an attorney, hundreds of dollars an hour to argue over something that's not worth your money or time, and just figuring out what you're willing to, part with, and what's your biggest ticket item priorities. Sometimes I have clients give me, multi-page lists of every single antique or plate in their kitchen that they want to hold on to. In fact, we just dealt with that issue back in November when we were going to trial on a case. And then I have clients that are like, I don't really care. Let them keep everything. I just want to start fresh and move on. And if I'm going to compare those two situations, the latter, much better mindset for your own sanity in a case like that.
Yeah, you definitely feel that the vacuum story is there's some other issues there that weren't related to house cleaning.
Yes, for sure.
Also, 2 vacuums. Interesting. I wonder why they had 2 vacuums.
2 different purposes. One was a hand one, and one had a feature where, it was for different types of flooring. So,
okay. You know what? I stand corrected. We don't need to unpack that any further. Are there any specific financial tools or professionals like financial planners or accountants that individuals should consult before filing for divorce?
So it is important for, especially if you have any kind of like 401k or any kind of stocks, things like that, that you do bring in your financial planners and just trying to figure out what's going on with it. Also, if maybe you have like a dual financial planner and you're not necessarily feeling comfortable with speaking with that person, same
Right.
goes for CPA, you can maybe discuss with a different financial planner or CPA. That way there isn't a lot of overlap and you can kind of confide in them with what you need and get the information that you want.
That's a
Another
good
thing
tip.
that's really important is if there's a home involved, I typically like to have clients discuss it with like a mortgage broker to see if they can qualify for another loan to get the home, because sometimes you want the home, you really want the home, you want to keep it, it's just not feasible. And you can, at the beginning of it, at least look and see like if you're going to be able to purchase that home from your other spouse or pay them out, buy them out. And if not, I think that gives you some time to at least sit with it and understand and realize that you might not be able to keep that home and kind of plan better as far as what needs to happen in the future when you get to that point. And we're really big advocates for therapists. We think that therapy is incredibly important. Again, you're not in the right mind usually when you're going through this divorce process. It's very difficult, it's very tough, especially when there's kids involved and you need an outlet to be able to speak to somebody who's a third party who can kind of give you maybe some perspective and tell you to be gentle and nice to yourself. So those would be the ones that I suggest.
Oh, I think those are great tips. All right. Well, thank you for joining us on Navigating Consumer and Family Law Challenges, insights from SoCal's trusted attorneys, Sara Khosroabadi and Amanda Hill. To connect with the team, you can check out KandHLawGroup.com. And please like and subscribe to the channel and leave us a review. Sara, Amanda, always great talking to you guys. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.